More than 6,000 years ago, in a land that should never have supported civilization, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and changed humanity forever. They built the first cities. They invented writing. They created laws, mathematics, and empires that would shape every civilization that followed. But we still don't know who they were. We don't know where they came from. And we don't know why their language resembles nothing else on Earth. Today we uncover the mystery of the Sumerians, the first civilization in human history. This is southern Mesopotamia, the floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's a landscape of mud and marshes with no forests, almost no stone, and virtually no metal deposits. The rivers flood without warning, destroying fields and drowning settlements. Unlike Egypt's Nile, which rises and falls on a predictable schedule, these waters are violent and erratic. Entire channels shift course, turning productive farmland into impossible swamp. It's one of the most resource-poor environments in the ancient world. And yet it was here in this harsh, unstable land that the world's first civilization emerged. The origins of the Sumerians remain one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. Before they appear in the record, the region was already occupied by earlier cultures. The Ubaid people built irrigation canals, mud brick temples, and distinctive pottery across southern Mesopotamia. Then came the Uruk culture, which constructed the first monumental architecture and developed clay tokens, an early system for tracking goods that would eventually evolve into writing. The Sumerians appeared near the end of the 4th millennium BC. But who were they, and where did they come from? Some scholars argue they were native to the region, direct descendants of the Ubaid and Uruk peoples, gradually developing into what we recognize as Sumerian civilization. But the linguistic evidence tells a different story. The Sumerian language isn't related to any known language family, not to Semitic languages like Akkadian, not to Indo-European, not to anything. It stands completely alone. Even stranger, the names of major Sumerian cities, Nippur, Lagash, Uruk, aren't Sumerian words. These places had already been settled before Sumerian speakers arrived. River names, lake names, even basic agricultural terms like plow, farmer, and furrow were borrowed from earlier languages. All of this suggests that Sumerian-speaking people migrated into a region that was already inhabited, adopting elements of the existing culture while bringing something entirely new. So where did they come from? According to Sumerian mythology, their ancestors arrived by sea from a distant paradise called Dilmun, a land modern scholars identify with the island of Bahrain. Archaeological evidence does show Sumerian contact with Dilmun, but only in later periods. Some researchers have proposed connections to the Indus Valley civilization, others to Anatolia, the Caucasus, or even Central Asia. But no theory has gained consensus. The truth is, we still don't know. Their origins remain an open question, a mystery preserved in the very clay tablets that recorded their existence. But if their origins are uncertain, what we do know is how they transformed the world they found. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BC, something unprecedented was taking shape along those unpredictable rivers. Something that would define human society for the next 6,000 years. By the turn of the 3rd millennium BC, villages that had existed for generations began changing in ways no human society had experienced before. Populations concentrated, structures grew taller, labor divided into roles that had never existed, scribes who never farmed, priests who never built, administrators who controlled resources they never produced. This wasn't gradual adaptation. It was transformation. What made it possible was water, but not in the way you might think. The Tigris and Euphrates don't behave like rivers that nurture civilizations. They flood violently in late spring. When snow melt from distant mountains surges through channels too narrow to contain it. Fields drown, settlements wash away, and then just as unpredictably, the water recedes, sometimes shifting course entirely, abandoning irrigation networks that took years to construct. There's no warning, no rhythm, no guarantee. The Sumerians responded by building something that had never existed before, a coordinated system of canals, dikes, and reservoirs spanning hundreds of square kilometers. This wasn't simple irrigation. It was environmental redesign on a scale that required thousands of laborers working in synchronized effort across multiple settlements. A single city-state managed roughly 300 square kilometers of interconnected waterways, an area comparable to modern-day Detroit. But managing such a system created a problem. Who decides where water flows? Who determines which fields flood and which stay dry? Who organizes the labor, tracks the contributions, and ensures cooperation between villages that might otherwise compete? The answer wasn't democratic councils or tribal elders. It was something new. Temple administrations led by figures called NCI, priest leaders who claimed authority not through conquest, but through their ability to organize the unorganizable. They didn't just manage water, they managed people. And in doing so, they created the first urban societies. Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Erodu. Within just a few generations, more than 20 city-states emerged across southern Mesopotamia, each one a densely packed center of specialized labor, monumental architecture, and hierarchical control. These weren't villages that grew large. They were something fundamentally different. Engines of complexity that required constant coordination to survive. But if civilization emerged here through necessity, why did it never collapse? What kept these fragile systems functioning when the rivers themselves fought against them? The layers beneath Sumerian cities tell a different story than the one preserved in their texts. When archaeologists excavate sites like Erodu and Uruk, they don't find a sudden beginning. They find continuous occupations stretching back thousands of years, settlements built on top of settlements, each layer slightly more complex than the one below. The deepest levels reveal a people we now call the Ubaid culture who occupied southern Mesopotamia as early as the 6th millennium BC. They built irrigation canals. They constructed mud brick temples with characteristic T-shaped floor plans. They produced distinctive pottery, dark painted designs on pale clay found across hundreds of kilometers, suggesting either widespread trade or cultural unity. These weren't primitives waiting for civilization to arrive. They were organized, skilled, and deeply rooted. Then around 3400 BC, something shifted. A new material culture appeared, what archaeologists call the Uruk period. Settlements expanded rapidly. Temples grew into massive platforms raised on artificial mountains of brick. And for the first time, clay tokens appeared. Small geometric shapes used to track goods moving in and out of temple storerooms. Cones for grain, spheres for livestock, cylinders for oil. It wasn't writing yet, but it was accounting. It was memory made external. The Uruk culture built the largest structure of its time, a temple complex at the city of Uruk itself, covering more than 5,000 square meters. Its walls were decorated with colored stone mosaics. Its interior housed vast storage rooms filled with clay tokens, tens of thousands of them, each representing sheep, grain, oil, labor obligations. This wasn't a religious center. It was an administrative machine, and yet archaeologists cannot identify a clean break between the Ubaid, the Uruk, and what eventually becomes Sumerian. The pottery changes gradually. The temples grow larger but remain in the same locations. The irrigation systems expand but follow the same engineering principles. There is no invasion layer, no mass destruction, no sudden replacement of one people by another. So if the Sumerians didn't conquer or displace the people who came before them, what happened? Did they arrive and merge? Did they adopt the existing culture so completely that they became indistinguishable except for their language? Or were they always there and Sumerian is simply the name we give to a culture that evolved locally but spoke a language we can no longer trace? The archaeological record offers no clear answer. Temples grow larger, pottery styles shift, administrative tools become more sophisticated, but there's no invasion layer, no mass destruction, no sudden replacement of one people by another. Instead, there's continuity interrupted by something we can't see in the ground. What changed wasn't the land or the tools or even the buildings. What changed was language. At some point, the people managing the temples, recording the transactions, and naming the gods began speaking Sumerian, a tongue unrelated to anything that came before. But the temples themselves, the irrigation systems, the clay tokens used for record keeping, those were already there. So if the infrastructure of civilization was already in place, what exactly did the Sumerians bring with them? And if they inherited so much from the cultures before them, why do we call them the first civilization and not the people who built the foundations they used? Every language belongs to a family except Sumerian. Linguists have traced the origins of nearly every ancient tongue. Adian connects to Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic through the Semitic family. Egyptian links to Berber and Cushitic languages through Afroasiatic roots. Even dead languages like Hittite and Sanskrit reveal their ancestry through shared vocabulary and grammar. But Sumerian, it stands alone. No relatives, no ancestors, no linguistic cousins anywhere on Earth. This isn't simply an unsolved puzzle. It's an anomaly that shouldn't exist. Languages don't emerge in isolation. They evolve from earlier forms, borrowing and adapting over generations. Yet, Sumerian appears in the written record, fully formed, complex, sophisticated, and utterly disconnected from every other known language. Scholars have searched for connections to Uralic, Dravidian, even Tibetan and Basque. None fit. The grammar is unique. The phonology is distinct. The vocabulary shares no roots with neighboring tongues. And then there are the place names: Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, Kish. These are the great cities of Zuma. But their names aren't Sumerian words. Linguists can identify this because Sumerian word structure follows predictable patterns, and these names don't match. They're older. The same holds true for the river sign and Buranun. The Sumerian names for the Tigris and Euphrates are borrowed terms, not native Sumerian. Even basic agricultural vocabulary like farmer, plow, and furrow came from a language that preceded them. The Sumerians named their gods. They recorded their kings. They documented their laws and rituals. But they didn't name the land they lived on. Someone else did. Their own mythology offers a clue, but only deepens the mystery. Sumerian texts describe their ancestors arriving by sea from a place called Dilmun, a paradise island identified by modern scholars as Bahrain. Archaeological evidence confirms contact between Sumer and Bahrain, but only from the 3rd millennium BC onward, centuries after. The Sumerians were already established in Mesopotamia. The timeline doesn't align. Some researchers have proposed that Sumerian speakers originated in the Indus Valley, pointing to shared administrative practices and early trade connections. Others suggest Anatolia, the Caucasus, or even Central Asia. Each theory has fragments of supporting evidence, but none has enough to convince the broader scholarly community. The problem is that archaeology reveals material culture, pottery, tools, buildings, but not language. You can't excavate grammar. The Sumerians built on top of older settlements, used irrigation systems already in place, and worshipped in temples that predated their written records. Materially, they blended seamlessly with the cultures before them. The only thing that marks them as distinct is the language they spoke and left no trace of where it came from. So we're left with a civilization that transformed human history, yet has no identifiable origin. A people who inherited a landscape already shaped by others, but brought with them a tongue that connects to nothing. They appear in the record not as conquerors or colonizers, but as something stranger, an insertion into an existing world, speaking words no one else had ever spoken. If they didn't conquer the land and they didn't displace the population, how did they rise to control the most complex societies on Earth? The earliest Sumerian cities had no palaces. This is not an assumption. It's what the archaeological record shows. Temples dominate the landscape, massive platforms rising above the floodplain, their walls thick enough to store grain for thousands, their courtyards large enough to gather entire populations. But royal residences, throne rooms, fortified centers of monarchical power, they don't appear until much later. For centuries, the most complex societies on Earth had no kings. So, who was in charge? The answer lies in thousands of clay tablets recovered from temple archives. These aren't mythological texts or royal proclamations. They're administrative records, receipts, work assignments, land distributions, ration lists, and they reveal something unexpected. The temples weren't just religious centers, they were economic engines. They owned the land. They controlled the labor. They distributed food and resources to workers, artisans, and farmers. In essence, they were the government. At the head of each temple stood a figure called the Ini, usually translated as governor or priest king, though neither term captures what the role actually was. The Ini wasn't a king in any traditional sense. He didn't inherit power through royal lineage. He wasn't a military commander. His authority came from his position as the god's representative on earth, responsible for managing the divine estate. The title itself translates literally as the one who divides the temple land. Because in Sumerian thought, all land belonged to the gods. The Ini merely organized its use, but he didn't rule alone. Records describe councils of elders, respected members of the community who deliberated on major decisions. Some texts reference citizen assemblies, gatherings where free men discussed public matters and gave consent to significant actions. The NCI held administrative power, but it was balanced by communal voices. Authority was distributed, not concentrated. Decisions were collective, not autocratic. This wasn't democracy in the modern sense. It wasn't egalitarian, but it also wasn't despotism. Power operated through religious legitimacy, economic control, and community consensus, an intricate balance that kept early Sumerian cities functioning without centralized monarchs. And yet this system had a fundamental vulnerability. Temple economies depended on irrigation. Irrigation depended on cooperation, and cooperation broke down when cities competed for the same water. A canal dug upstream could starve fields downstream. A dam built on contested land could trigger conflict. As populations grew and resources tightened, disputes became inevitable, not just between individuals, but between entire city-states. The NC was a manager, a priest, an administrator, but he was not a warrior. And when disputes over water and land could no longer be resolved through negotiation, the Sumerians faced a problem their system wasn't designed to handle. Someone had to organize defense. Someone had to lead armies. Someone had to make decisions quickly without councils or assemblies slowing the process. And so reluctantly at first, cities began appointing temporary military leaders during times of crisis. Figures called lugal, meaning big man. At first, these roles were meant to be short-term, emergency powers granted for the duration of a conflict, then relinquished once peace returned. But once power is concentrated, it rarely gives itself back willingly. The transition from priest to king is recorded not in grand declarations, but in the slow accumulation of titles. Early inscriptions identify rulers simply as NCI, temple administrators, but by the mid-3rd millennium BC, a new term appears alongside it, lugal. At first, the two titles coexist. A ruler might be called Eni in religious contexts and lugal in military ones, as if the community still distinguished between sacred authority and war leadership. But over time, lugal begins to replace Ensai entirely. The shift is subtle in the records, but its implications are profound. Authority was no longer derived from managing the god's estate. It came from commanding armies. What caused this transformation wasn't ideology, it was necessity. Water conflicts between city-states escalated into sustained warfare. Fortification walls appear in the archaeological record, massive mud brick barriers encircling urban centers, some more than 6 men thick. These weren't symbolic, they were built to withstand siege. Weapons become more standardized. Burial sites reveal organized military units with soldiers interred alongside their equipment in ways that suggest formal hierarchies. Warfare wasn't occasional raiding anymore. It was systematic, organized, and required permanent military leadership. Thiel emerged to meet that need. Initially appointed during crisis, these big men were expected to relinquish power once the threat passed. But the threats didn't pass. Conflicts became chronic, and a commander who had just led his city to victory, who controlled loyal armed men and enjoyed popular support, was not easily convinced to step aside for a council of elders and a priest administrator. So the lugal stayed, and then something even more significant happened. The title became hereditary. Sons succeeded fathers. Military leadership turned into dynastic rule. The Sumerian King List, a document compiling rulers from legendary times to historical periods, begins to record unbroken lineages, father to son, generation after generation. This wasn't a return to temporary leadership, it was the birth of monarchy. With kingship came palaces. For the first time, archaeological sites revealed distinct royal residences separate from temples. These structures aren't just homes. They're administrative centers with throne rooms, audience halls, and storage facilities rivaling those of the temples. Power was physically relocating from sacred precincts to secular fortresses. The NCI didn't disappear entirely. In some cities, the title persisted as a subordinate role, more like a mayor or high priest under royal authority. But the balance had shifted irreversibly. Kings commanded armies, controlled taxation, directed construction projects, and made unilateral decisions that once required communal consent. Councils of elders still existed in theory, but their influence waned. Citizen assemblies were convened less frequently, their role reduced to affirming decisions already made. This was not a coup, it was erosion, a slow redistribution of power justified by military necessity and accepted because the alternative was conquest by rival cities. Yet this consolidation of authority created a new problem. Kings ruled through command, but commands are temporary. They exist in the moment, spoken and then lost. If a king wanted his authority to outlive him, if he wanted laws, treaties, land grants, and decrees to endure beyond his voice, he needed something that had never existed before. He needed his words to become permanent. And so just as war reshaped governance, the demands of governance reshaped something far more fundamental, human memory itself. Before writing, human knowledge died with the people who carried it. A farmer's understanding of flood patterns, a priest's memorized hymns, a merchant's trade routes. All of it vanished when they did. Societies could accumulate experience across generations through oral tradition. But memory was fragile. It distorted. It simplified. It forgot. Humanity had no way to preserve complexity across time until someone in Sumer pressed a reed into wet clay and changed the nature of thought itself. But writing didn't begin as language. It began as numbers. The earliest examples aren't poetry or prayers. They're accounting records. Small clay tokens, cones, spheres, cylinders used to track goods moving through temple storerooms. One cone equals one measure of grain. One sphere equals one sheep. These tokens were pressed into soft clay envelopes to create tamper-proof records of transactions. Over time, administrators realized they didn't need the physical tokens. They could just press their shapes into the clay. Symbols replaced objects. Then something unexpected happened. The symbols began representing not just things but sounds. A pictograph of a foot originally meant foot, but the Sumerian word for foot du also meant to go. So the symbol began representing the sound du regardless of meaning. Other symbols followed the same pattern. Images became phonetic components. Symbols could now be combined to write any word, even abstract concepts that had no physical form. By 3200 BC, Sumerian scribes had developed a full writing system, cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped marks left by reeds pressed into clay. And once language could be written, everything changed. Kings issued law codes, rules that would outlive their reign. The earliest known legal reforms come from Urukagina of Lagash, who documented protections for widows, orphans, and the poor around 2300 BC. These weren't suggestions or oral traditions. They were enforceable standards preserved in permanent form. Later, Ur-Nammu of Ur created the oldest surviving law code detailing penalties for crimes, procedures for disputes, and protections for property. Justice was no longer dependent on the memory of elders. It was encoded. Myths were recorded. The Epic of Gilgamesh, parts of which date to the early dynastic period, became the world's oldest known literary work, a story about mortality, friendship, and the limits of power, copied and recopied for thousands of years. Prayers were standardized, ensuring that rituals performed in one generation matched those of the next. Medical texts documented treatments. Mathematical tablets taught geometry and algebra. Astronomical records tracked celestial movements with precision that wouldn't be matched for millennia. But perhaps the most revolutionary shift was educational. Scribal schools, eduba, literally tablet houses appeared in every major city. Students spent years mastering uniform, copying literary texts, practicing administrative documents, and memorizing vast lists of vocabulary. Thousands of student practice tablets survive, many with corrections marked by teachers. Writing wasn't just a tool for elites. It created a professional class whose authority came from knowledge, not lineage or military power. And then cuneiform spread. Neighboring peoples, Adians, Elamites, Hittites, even distant cultures in Anatolia and the Levant, adopted the script. They used it to write their own languages, adapting Sumerian signs to fit entirely different phonetic systems. Sumerian itself became a language of scholarship studied by scribes across the ancient Near East long after native speakers disappeared. Temples in Babylon taught Sumerian grammar 1,000 years after Sumer fell. Kings in Assyria collected Sumerian literary texts as prized possessions. Sumerian culture had achieved something unprecedented. It outlived its creators. The ideas, laws, myths, and administrative systems encoded in cuneiform continued shaping civilizations long after Sumerian political power collapsed. But that raises an unsettling question. If Sumerian knowledge spread so widely that others mastered it, refined it, and used it to build their own empires, what happened when those others turned that knowledge against Sumer itself? By the 24th century BC, the Sumerians had created something they could no longer contain. Their writing system had spread north into Adian-speaking regions. Their gods were worshipped in cities they'd never ruled. Their administrative techniques were copied by peoples who had once been peripheral to Mesopotamian power. Sumerian culture had become the foundation of Near Eastern civilization, but Sumerian political control was fragmenting. City-states that had once coordinated through temples and trade were now locked in cycles of warfare, each vying for dominance over shrinking resources. And then a figure appeared who would unify them, but not as a Sumerian. His name was Sargon, and he came from Akkad, a city somewhere in northern Mesopotamia whose precise location has never been found. The inscriptions describe him as a man of humble origins, possibly a cupbearer to the king of Kish, who seized power through a combination of military brilliance and ruthless ambition. Around 2334 BC, Sargon conquered the Sumerian city-states one by one. Uruk-Lagash. He didn't destroy them, he absorbed them. What Sargon created had never existed before. A multi-ethnic empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, governed not by a council of independent cities, but by a single centralized authority. For the first time in history, diverse peoples, Sumerians, Adians, Alamites, and others were administered under one political system. His armies campaigned as far as Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains. His trade networks reached the Indus Valley. The scale was unprecedented. But here's what makes Sargon's empire so strange. He didn't replace Sumerian culture. He adopted it. Akkadian became the administrative language, but cuneiform, the Sumerian script, remained the writing system. Sumerian gods were worshipped in Adian temples, often under their original names. Legal codes continued to follow Sumerian precedents. Scribes still learned Sumerian as the language of scholarship and religion, even as they conducted daily business in Akkadian. Sargon even claimed legitimacy by taking the title King of Sumer and Akkad, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as the rightful inheritor of Sumerian authority. In effect, Sumerian civilization survived, but Sumerian independence did not. The paradox deepens when you examine the archaeological record. Adian imperial expansion brought Sumerian artistic styles, architectural techniques, and religious iconography to regions that had never been under Sumerian control. Cylinder seals, small engraved stones used to mark documents, show Sumerian mythological scenes produced in cities hundreds of kilometers from Sumer itself. Temples built in the Akkadian heartland replicate Sumerian designs. The culture spread farther under foreign rule than it ever had under native governance. Yet something essential was lost. Sumerian as a spoken language began to decline. Administrative records shift increasingly to Adian. By the end of Sargon's dynasty, which lasted roughly 140 years, Sumerian speakers were becoming a minority in their own homeland. The cities remained, the temples still functioned, but the people who had once defined Sumerian identity were being absorbed into a larger, more diverse imperial population. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed the transformation even further. He declared himself a god, something no Sumerian ruler had dared, and commissioned monuments depicting himself trampling enemies beneath divine symbols. His inscriptions boast of conquests reaching the four corners of the world. The Akkadian Empire at its height controlled more territory than any previous state, enforcing tribute systems, standardizing weights and measures, and maintaining a standing army that could be deployed across vast distances. But empires built on conquest are fragile. Around 2150 BC, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. The causes are debated: environmental stress, internal rebellion, invasions by the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains. Whatever the combination, centralized authority disintegrated, cities reverted to independence, trade networks fractured. The first great empire in history ended not with a dramatic fall, but with a slow unraveling into regionalism and disorder. And yet, even as the empire fell, Sumerian ideas endured. The next wave of rulers, whether Sumerian or not, would continue writing in cuneiform, worshipping the same gods and invoking the same legal traditions. Sumerian culture had become the bedrock of Mesopotamian civilization, outlasting every political structure built upon it. But that raises a deeper question. If Sumerian culture survived imperial collapse, could the Sumerians themselves reclaim control? Or had they already become something else entirely, dissolved into the very civilization they created? For a brief moment, Sumer became more organized than it had ever been, and that may have been its undoing. After the Akkadian collapse, southern Mesopotamia fractured into competing powers. But around 2112 BC, a new dynasty emerged from the city of Ur, the third dynasty as scholars call it, and did something remarkable. It didn't just restore Sumerian independence. It perfected Sumerian administration to a degree that previous generations had never achieved. Centralization reached heights that would have been unimaginable to the early Ensa priest administrators. The kings of three, particularly Onamu and his son Shuli, rebuilt the irrigation systems that had deteriorated during decades of conflict. They constructed massive ziggurats, stepped temple platforms that dominated the skyline of every major city. The ziggurat at Ur still stands partially intact today, a monument to architectural ambition. These weren't just religious symbols, they were declarations of control, proof that the state could marshal thousands of laborers toward a single coordinated purpose. But the most striking achievement was bureaucratic. The administrative archives are staggering in their detail. Scribes tracked everything, grain distributions down to the leader, labor assignments down to the day, livestock inventories down to individual animals. One archive from the city of Podsish Daran records the movement of more than 300,000 sheep and goats over just a few decades. Workers received rations calculated precisely based on their tasks, more for heavy labor, less for supervisory roles, specific amounts for women, children, and slaves. The system was so efficient that some scholars have compared it to a command economy. Sumerian language was restored as the official tongue of administration, even though most of the population likely still spoke Adian. Legal reforms were codified under Ur-Nammu's law code, the earliest surviving example of written law, predating Hammurabi by more than 3 centuries. Trade networks were re-established. Weights and measures were standardized across the empire. For the first time since the Akkadian period, southern Mesopotamia functioned as a unified state. On the surface, it looked like a renaissance. Sumerian culture had returned to dominance. Political fragmentation had been overcome. Order had been restored, but the administrative tablets reveal something unsettling. The system was too efficient. Every worker, every ration, every resource was accounted for, meaning there was no slack, no flexibility, no room for disruption. The bureaucracy had optimized itself to the point where even small shocks could cascade into systemic failure. Crop shortages couldn't be absorbed through local reserves because reserves were centrally controlled. Labor shortages couldn't be compensated because labor assignments were rigidly defined. The entire structure depended on continuous, uninterrupted coordination. And then the disruptions came. Environmental stress intensified. Soil salinization caused by centuries of irrigation without proper drainage reduced agricultural yields. Fields that once produced abundant barley began yielding only salt-tolerant wheat and eventually nothing at all. The rivers themselves became less predictable, shifting courses and undermining canal systems that had taken generations to build. Climate records suggest a prolonged drought around 2000 BC, straining an already fragile system. At the same time, external pressures mounted. Nomadic groups, Amorites from the west, Elamites from the east, pressed against the borders. The centralized state that had seemed so powerful struggled to defend its frontiers while maintaining internal order. And because everything was interconnected, a breakdown in one area triggered failures elsewhere. Lost tax revenue meant fewer rations. Fewer rations meant labor unrest. Labor unrest meant reduced productivity. Reduced productivity meant even less revenue. The administration grew more desperate. Tablets from the final years show increasingly frantic attempts to maintain control. Reassignments of workers, emergency grain transfers, military conscriptions. But the system had been designed for stability, not crisis. It couldn't adapt. So if the 3 represented the peak of Sumerian organizational achievement, the culmination of 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge, why did it collapse so completely? And why, once it fell, did Sumer never recover? In 2004 BC, the city of Ur fell, and with it the last independent Sumerian state. The end is documented not in triumphal inscriptions, but in lamentation texts, poems of grief so raw they were copied and recited for centuries afterward. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur describes the gods themselves abandoning the city. Nana, the moon god and Ur's patron deity, is said to have turned away as enemies breached the walls. Temples were desecrated, granaries burned, bodies filled the streets. The text doesn't just mourn the physical destruction, it mourns the collapse of divine order, the sense that the world had broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. The invaders were Elamites from the east, but they weren't the cause. They were the final blow. The system had already been failing. Salinization had turned fertile fields into white crusts of salt. Bureaucratic records show grain yields dropping year after year. Canals silted up faster than they could be cleared. The rivers unmanaged shifted course and flooded unpredictably. The infrastructure that had sustained Sumer for millennia was collapsing under its own weight. Amorite pastoralists who had been migrating into Mesopotamia for decades occupied the weakened cities. They didn't conquer Sumer in a traditional sense. They filled the vacuum left by its disintegration. Within a generation, Sumerian political structures ceased to exist. The title king of Sumer and Akkad was claimed by Amorite rulers who governed from new capitals, Ain-Lassa, and eventually Babylon. But here's what makes the end of Sumer so strange. The Sumerians didn't vanish. They dissolved. Sumerian temples continued functioning under new management. Scribes still copied Sumerian literary texts. Sumerian gods were worshipped by Babylonians and Assyrians for another 2,000 years. The legal principles, mathematical systems, and astronomical records developed in Sumer became the foundation of every subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. Even the language survived not as a living tongue, but as the scholarly language of priests and scholars studied the way Latin would be studied in medieval Europe. Sumer ended not because it was forgotten, but because it was absorbed. Its innovations became so fundamental to Near Eastern civilization that they no longer needed a Sumerian state to sustain them. The people who had once called themselves Sumerian intermarried, adopted new languages, and merged into the broader populations of Babylon and Assyria. Their identity faded, but their legacy became inescapable. Civilization, it turns out, is not a single invention. It's a continuous act of balance between order and flexibility, control and adaptation, growth and sustainability. The Sumerians were the first to attempt that balance. They succeeded for nearly 3,000 years. And when they failed, they taught every civilization that followed a lesson. We're still learning complexity can sustain itself for centuries, but it can also become the very thing that destroys it. If the first civilization collapsed under the weight of its own sophistication, what does that say about ours?